I'm going to talk about how we can combine archival, oral and DNA evidence to recreate family histories. I may be repeating some of what Maurice said earlier. The notes that you're going to see on the screen are on my website, pwaldron.info/Mountbellew. I think Gerard is recording this, but I'm recording it as well, so hopefully we'll put a recording up on YouTube at some stage. So we're all used. Can you read that? I think we might need a slightly bigger font size. Can the people down the back read that? Yeah. The three channels through which we collect our family history are the oral traditions, the archival sources, and the DNA evidence. As Seamus said earlier, some of us started in our teenage years going around talking to our older relatives to see what we could glean from the oral memory of family history. When we got a little older, we started going into the archives. I remember going to the General Register office when it was in the Custom House back in the early 1980s. It's moved about 4 times since. Then the internet came along and a lot of those records went online. Don't think that everything is online. I will show you later how you have to go offline sometimes to break down the brick walls in your family history. And now we have the DNA evidence that we've been talking about all day, which help to fill in some of the gaps. Sometimes it's not clear what's oral evidence and what's archival evidence. I'm sure there have been many cases when a grief-stricken relative has gone in to register the death of somebody who's just died, and the registrar has said name of deceased, father's name, mother's name. And the person registering the death has given his own father's name and his own mother's name instead of the deceased's father's and mother's name. And then they ask what age was the deceased. The deceased mightn't even have known, let alone the people who are left behind. So things on a death certificate are not always correct. As you know, things on the census returns are not always correct. I've come across many examples of people who were younger in the 1911 census than they were in the 1901 census. So they had a guess, and the guess was wrong in both years. We'll see more of that later. And then you might have family letters, diaries, things like that. They're somewhere in between the oral and the archival. I like this quote from Richard White, who wrote a wonderful little book called Remembering a Hanagram. A Hanagram is a little townland in North Kerry near Ballylongford, where Richard's mother had come from. He says, I once thought of my mother's stories as history. I thought memory was history. Then I became a historian, and after many years I've come to realize that only careless historians confuse memory and history. History is the enemy of memory. The two stalk each other across the fields of the past, claiming the same terrain. History forges weapons from what memory has forgotten or suppressed. Few non-historians realize how many scraps a life leaves. We as genealogists know that. These scraps do not necessarily form a story in and of themselves, but they're always calling stories into doubt, always challenging memories, always trailing off into foreign places. So now we not only have history and memory, but we have genetics as well. So it's a three-way battle instead of a two-way battle, and we've got to try and figure out which is right, which is wrong. If there's a gap, where do we go to fill the gap? So we're the judge and jury over the three types of evidence. So here's an example. I'm going to try and keep my examples reasonably anonymized so as not to upset any of my living friends and relatives. This one is so well anonymized, I gave somebody a preview of it yesterday and he assumed he knew who I was talking about and he got it completely wrong. Hopefully the Wi-Fi is working and we can look at the census return for the Killeen family in Kilrush. This is the 1911 census. Husband and wife and a very large family of children, including Patrick, who was 16, and Christopher, who was 8, described as the son of the head of household. I know Patrick's descendants, I know Christopher's descendants. There's one of each in the DNA databases. They match more or less as you would expect for second cousins once removed. 100 to 120 centimorgans shared. So we thought that that family tree was fine. Then I stumbled across Christopher's marriage records. And I bring this up live, but hopefully it won't make me fill in too many boxes. All you need to give is your initials when you're signing in. And down the bottom of this page, we have the marriage of Christopher Killeen in 1934, even though he's in the census in 1911 with a father and a mother. The father's name and surname are blank, and the rank or profession of father are blank. So this is an example of what we call an NPE, not the parent expected. He doesn't know who his father is. Normally these things turn up in the DNA results, but this is the very opposite. This is a case of the genetic evidence telling us it looks okay, the census telling us it looks okay, and then we find another official state record which says maybe the DNA isn't exactly as it was, and we don't know. My suspicion is that Christopher, who's described as a son in the census return, was actually a grandson, that maybe one of the daughters had a child who was raised as her brother rather than as her daughter. That's just a guess. That relationship would be close enough that the DNA can't distinguish it from the relationship that the census specifies. Christopher's first wife died. Here's the second marriage cert. This is even more blatant. The father's name and surname is just down as unknown, and the rank or profession is left blank again. So, as I say, there are three types of evidence. Any one of them can throw up a surprise. So let me just review some of the stuff Maurice said earlier about the different types of DNA that we can use. When a child is born, the sperm brings either a Y chromosome or an X chromosome and 22 autosomes from the father. The egg brings one X chromosome from the mother, 22 autosomes from the mother, and the mitochondrial DNA. So they have different inheritance paths. Maurice talked about this earlier. I don't need to go into the details. The Y chromosome comes down the male line like the surname. So here's my family tree. My Y chromosome came with the Waldron surname from my father, Paddy Sr., my grandfather, Jack, my great-grandfather, Thomas, my great-great-grandfather, Thomas. My mitochondrial DNA came down the female line from my mother, who was a Durkin, from her mother, who was a Durkin before and after marriage, from her mother, who was an O'Neill, from her mother, who was a Mrs. O'Neill, maiden name still to be determined. The autosomal DNA comes from all 16 people on this generation, roughly equally, exactly half from the father, exactly half from the mother. There can be some random variation beyond that as to how much you get from each grandparent, great-grandparent, and so on. And the X chromosome is a little more complicated. We won't go into that. I'm going to talk in my examples just about using autosomal DNA. Seamus has talked about using the Y-DNA, using the STR markers for a surname study. Maurice talked about using STR markers and SNP markers for the Gleason surname study. Sometimes if we have a theory that two women have the same mother, we might look at their mitochondrial DNA to test that specific theory. Sometimes if we have a theory that two men have the same mother, we might look at the X chromosome to test that theory. But they're used to answer specific questions rather than for fishing ships, which is what we use autosomal DNA for. I encourage you all to have your autosomal DNA on all the major DNA websites, which I now count as being getmatch.com, Family Tree DNA, Ancestry DNA, and as of the last few months, MyHeritage. I know 6 months ago I was working with Jim Palmer, who's a famous American baseball player, who's now 72. He's adopted. There he is in action during pre-game ceremonies, not during his actual playing career. His wife decided it's time to find out who your birth parents were. He was adopted in 1946, I guess. Grew up with an adoptive father and mother. The adoptive father died when he was about 8. The adoptive mother remarried. So his surname Palmer is actually his adoptive mother's second husband's surname. So this made it rather difficult when he tried to get any paperwork related to his adoption. But we solved the case purely using DNA. His father was a Getteran from County Leitrim, a very unusual surname. His mother was a Maroney from Kilmihill in West Clare. So now he knows exactly who he is. We're hoping to see him in Clare soon to visit his ancestral haunts. When he got a good match on MyHeritage, we weren't sure whether it was because the MyHeritage matching algorithm was completely wrong, which it was initially, or whether it was a genuine match. It turned out to be genuine. They fixed their matching algorithm about last October, and all is now well with MyHeritage. And as you saw from Jared's chart, they've grown their market share to be the 3rd biggest company. So I think we all need to get in there as well. I don't like 23andMe. It's more interested in the health things. It's not doing anything to help genealogists. So Jim asked earlier, who has done DNA? Let me do the opposite. Is there anybody here who is not already in the DNA databases? 2 people. We'll spub you before the day is out. So I hope you have all gone through these steps. If you haven't, now is the time to do it. People need to see not only the DNA evidence, but the oral and archival evidence as to what you already know about your family history. Maybe you're adopted and you know nothing, but even if you just know your parents or your grandparents, put that information on all the DNA websites attached to your DNA results. Put up a pedigree chart. All you need to put up are details of your immediate ancestors, your direct ancestors. You don't need to put up your siblings or your cousins or any living person who's going to be upset about being on a website or having their privacy invaded. There's one version of my family tree. You saw the version from Ancestral Quest already. That one is from the next generation, which is what I use for my website. Ancestral Quest, we saw Ancestry DNA puts up pedigree charts in various forms. It tries to put 10 generations in. You can't see all that on one screen. You have to scroll up and down. You can upload a getcom file. It's very simple. I do recommend that you use desktop software to store your information. If you're using Ancestral Quest, all you say is File, Export, and then you want to export a partial file, and you select the individuals to include, and not sure how that's selected. Ellen will select myself so that it looks right. File, export, partial, select. Now it's looking at me, and I can tell it select all my ancestors, 999 generations if I have them. I don't want to include any descendants. That will create a file that shows only the people I got my DNA from. They're the only people you need to put on the DNA websites. You're not invading anyone's privacy. You can even, when you've done that, on the previous screen here, you can tick that to turn off full information on living. You can even turn off the names on the living people. You certainly won't invade anyone's privacy if you do that, and it'll still be just as helpful to your DNA matches and working out who the common ancestor with you is. All the other genealogy programs have similar features. They don't all allow you to pick a subset of the individuals in the database. Don't use Ancestry.com to enter your data because they have an all or nothing facility for exporting getcoms, and you can't separate the living and the dead, and you can't separate the direct ancestors from the others. Little bit about privacy and anonymity. I think it's ironic that a lot of people who have sent off their DNA to DNA databases are trying to preserve their anonymity, and they've done it in order to remove the anonymity of the ancestors that they know nothing about. It's a little hypocritical to try and unearth facts about your dead ancestors without being willing to give away any information about yourself. Please publish your family trees. And I'll give you two examples. The one that Maurice mentioned earlier. If you had a mass murderer in your family, your extended family, a third or fourth cousin, would you object if your DNA was used to take him off the streets? I don't know, some people have been objecting. The man in California who they call the Golden State Killer has been sought by law enforcement for decades, and it was announced a week or two ago that a suspect had been arrested on the basis of a DNA search involving GetMatch.com, starting with his third and fourth cousins and narrowing in to find somebody who was in the right place at the right time to have committed these crimes. And 5 different people have sent me emails with newspaper stories. I don't know whether it's the biggest story in the world outside DNA. Anytime I've looked at Facebook for the last week, all the posts have been about this story. So DNA has let the genie out of the bottle when it comes to family secrets. Adoptions, fostering, things like that. If you want to keep the family secret, well, keep your own DNA private. Don't put it in a public DNA database. But you've also got to keep the DNA of all your close relatives private, because it only takes one close relative to put DNA in the database to let one of these secrets out of the bottle. And there are a lot of things that people were ashamed of 50 or 100 years ago when it came to illegitimate births and so on. Culture has changed. That shame isn't there anymore. There were probably tens of thousands of adopted people in Ireland, hundreds of thousands or millions around the world, who are desperate to know their genetic heritage and to reconnect with their families. And we as genetic genealogists have the ability to help them, and I don't see why we shouldn't do that. So when you're using the DNA websites, give people some clues. Use your birth surname. If you're a married woman, you don't have your husband's DNA. Even if you normally use his surname, I recommend go back to the maiden surname for this. Make it clear whether the DNA comes from a man or a woman, so that we know whether there's a Y chromosome or one X chromosome or two X chromosomes available. A lot of women wish they had an X chromosome, so they go to their father or their brother or some other relative for Y DNA, and then they upload it under their own name. And sometimes they even manage to get through a loophole in the family tree DNA system, and they'll upload Y DNA sample from a male and an autosomal DNA data file from a female, and they'll manage to link them together, and the FTDNA system doesn't even notice they're doing something ridiculous. So don't do that, it confuses people. Avoid using pseudonyms. This is a great example that I came across recently, where I was struggling to identify two people that I came across in Ancestry DNA, and they obviously wanted to be as anonymous as possible. A mother and a daughter, I eventually discovered, had sent in their DNA. The Ancestry username was just Tara1234 or something like that, revealed nothing about who they were. There was a family tree. The DNA samples were attached to two records in the family tree. They were an aunt and a niece, not a mother and a daughter. So what this lady did was she created a new person in her parents' family and attached the DNA to that person, and created a new person in her own family and attached the second DNA kit to that person. So the relationship between the two kids didn't match the relationship shown by the family trees. Then she gave them initials which weren't their real initials, MR and DC. And I said, I wish I could find this person on GetMatch, and I couldn't. About 300 days later, I looked at GetMatch again, and I found a person whose email address and GetMatch username both began with Molly. And I said, these matches look very like these two people with the messed up family tree. So I contacted her on the email address, and she finally explained, yes, Molly's my dog's name. But it's not the dog's DNA, it's the mother's DNA and the daughter's DNA. People do have their dog's DNA tested. We had a talk about that at the conference in Belfast a few months ago. Manage your correspondence well. I hate having more than one place to search when I want to find somebody who I know I corresponded with 2 years ago about a DNA match. Keep it all in an email archive that you can search. On Ancestry and MyHeritage and 23andMe, you have to use their internal messaging systems. Just use them to ask for an email address and try and keep the correspondence together. You can use Facebook if you want, and people do sometimes send me Facebook messages about GetMatch, even though they have my email address. That drives me insane, because the Facebook messaging interface is so awful. When you get your results back, you might find new lessons about your ancestors. You might be able to upload an updated family tree, do that as well. And start keeping records of which of your relatives are in the DNA databases. So in Ancestral Quest, if I go back to myself, in the notes for myself, I've put in a tag with my GetMatch kit numbers, my FTDNA kit numbers, my Ancestry kit numbers, my Genesis kit numbers, and so on. So everybody I find on GetMatch has this GetMatch tag in the notes. And then when I want to search, I can define a field search, show me all the individuals where the notes have a GetMatch tag. Okay, I've already done that. Sorry, I didn't mean to hit the help key. So there's 1,419 people I have found and managed to connect up in some way to people I've researched. And I can say, show me how many of these are also descended from my ancestors in 999 generations. I actually now have 161 known relatives that I have found somewhere in the DNA databases. They don't all match me. Some of them are 6th and 7th and 10th cousins with whom I don't search any DNA, but I'm not doing too bad when I've 161 known relatives out there. So I'm going to end with a case study. I have how many minutes? 10. Okay, so I have time to go through this in some detail. The McMahons of Queren. I have two friends, Michael and Martin, I've called them. Michael I've known for donkey's years. Martin I've got to know through genealogy in the last few years. The first time I ever met Martin, I made an arrangement to take a DNA swab from him. So we both went, it was early 2016, we went to a meeting organising a 1916 centenary commemoration. And he had a pint in his hand when I met him, and I said, "You're not supposed to eat, drink, smoke, chew gum, or wash your teeth for an hour before you take your swab. So drink that pint quickly, and then we'll wait an hour, and then we'll swab you." So we did that. These two guys, they're second cousins, and they know their great-grandparents were John McMahon and Honor Hanrahan, and we found them in the census returns in a little, I was going to call it a village. It used to be a village. It had a shop and a school. The shop is gone. The school has only about 3 pupils left. It's now just a crossroads. So there's John McMahon, his wife Honor Hanrahan, and 2 children and a grandchild in the 1901 census. They're pretty well documented. There's another McMahon family nearby who we also have in the census, and they believe they're related, but they're not sure exactly how, or they weren't sure exactly how when we started this research. Michael's mother said the McMahons came from Donegal side. Here's the townland of Donegal in the West Clare Loophead Peninsula. If you're familiar with Kilkee, it's just outside Kilkee where the little red plus is there. And if I zoom out a little further, Querrin is just down here on the Shannon Estuary side of the peninsula. So they're from quite close together. The Google map says they're about 9.1 kilometres apart. There's Kilkee up here, there's the Shannon Estuary down the bottom, and there's a bog road that will take you from one place to the other in 12 minutes. That mightn't sound like a lot when you're researching a rare surname. When you're researching a surname like McMahon, there's 2,867 McMahons in County Clare in the 1911 surname. That's with the MC spelling. There'll be more with the MAC spelling. It's about 2.7% of the population of the county. So within a 10-mile radius of Querrin, there are a lot of other McMahon families, and it's hard to figure out which one we're looking for. There's a third McMahon family in Querrin today. We know they came from the east shortly before the 1901 census. A McMahon man came back to inherit his mother's home place from a childless couple. So the problem with John McMahon of Querrin is that he married in January 1861. I think almost as big a disaster from a genealogical point of view for genealogy in Ireland was when civil registration was introduced in what was then known as the United Kingdom in 1837. It applied only to England and Wales. Then in 1855, the Scots caught up, and they introduced a brilliant system where their birth records were as they normally are, but their marriage records, as early as 1855, asked for the father and the mother of the bride and the groom. And the death certificate asked for the father and the mother of the deceased. We finally caught up in 2004. In 1864, the Irish authorities copied the system from England and Wales when they should have copied the system from Scotland. So if only we had full civil registration in 1837 or in 1855 or in 1864 and didn't have to wait until 2004, genealogy would be a lot easier. So all we have to go on is up to 1864, the parish records, and hopefully here we'll find the marriage of John McMahon and Honor Hanrahan down in the bottom left. And barely even read the date. I'm not sure is that a 26 or a 28. John McMahon to Honora Hanrahan. He was from Querrin, she was from Clohan-Savon, right back at the Loophead Lighthouse almost. And the witnesses Martin McGrath and Bridget Keating. No parents' names. Martin, his neighbour, married twice, once in 1870, once in 1887. So we have 2 pieces of evidence which both give us Martin McMahon's father's name as Michael McMahon, a farmer, and they both confirm that Martin's residence at the time of marriage was Querrin. So what age were they? We have lots of evidence of Martin's age. He was 25 in 1870, he was 54 in 1901, he was 68 in 1911, he was 87 when he died in 1928. So that gives us an implied birth here anywhere from 1840 to 1847. We have less evidence for John. He was 70 in the census in 1901. He lived for another 3 years, but he only got to 72, so he could be born anywhere from 1830 to 1832. So they're close enough to be brothers. or they could be an uncle and a nephew, or they could be more distantly related. We know their father, if they were brothers, was Michael. We still have no idea who the mother was. So we go to Griffith's valuation. Here's the page from the original Griffith's valuation from Queren. And here we have Michael McMahon in number 48 and Michael McGrath next door in number 49. That will become significant in a minute. We have maps on Ask About Ireland, which purport to be Griffith's valuation maps. You click on that link and then you zoom and you zoom. So I prepared one earlier. Here's my screen grab showing Queren. This crossroads here is known as Nash's Cross to the present day. Michael Nash was a carpenter who lived in that little plot there, which is number 37 on this map. That number 37 was changed in 1874, I think. So this map is at least 20 years after Griffith's valuation, which was 1855. There's still a descendant of the Nash family living in that spot, a great grandson down through an all-female line. There's one Galway connection here. Michael Nash's granddaughter, Bridget Hederman, became a district nurse in Inisheer in the Aran Islands. And she wrote a wonderful little book in the early 1900s about her experiences in Inisheer, which you'll find online in archive.org. So 48 here was the McMahon farm, 49 here was the McGrath farm, 33 over here has been redrawn in the 20 years after Griffith's valuation. The boundaries are a little different, but that was owned by Foley's in 1855. And a few years later, it became owned jointly by Michael McMahon from this farm and Michael McGrath from this farm. And then in about 1864, it looks like each of them had a son who just married, and the land was divided between them, or at least the John McMahon we're looking for married in 1861, lived in Queren, and took over this piece of land up here from Michael McMahon. So it doesn't prove that they're father and son, but it certainly is pointing in that direction. We have John's grave in Kilfeera Cemetery, which is not the nearest cemetery to Queren. It's in the direction of Donegal, where the McMahons were supposed to have come from, erected by Michael in memory of his father John and his sister Bridget. It's another interesting quirk here. You would assume from that Bridget was a McMahon, and of course she was a McMahon because her father was a McMahon, but she was also a McMahon because her husband was a McMahon. She married on St. Patrick's Day in 1894. She died on Little Christmas Day in 1895 in childbirth with her first child. So I think if a young married woman died in those days, the assumption was the father will get married again and will want to be buried with his new wife. We'll bury the poor young mother in her family grave. So she was buried, looks from the inscription as the first person in this grave. We have a photograph of the grave erected by Michael McMahon in memory of his father John, who died July 8, 1904, age 72, and so on. Fairly plain stone, quite legible, easy to read. So at this stage, we've got to do some research offline. I went to the valuation office and I photographed the cancelled books, and I put photographs up on my own website, and down at the bottom there's an index file where you can actually say if I want to see who lived in 1862 in number 48. I know that's the page to look at, and go down to the bottom of the page, and there's Michael McMahon and Michael McGrath still living next to each other. So we can see from that number 48A, Michael McMahon's original house, passed to a Mary McMahon in 1864. So maybe that's his widow. That might be our first clue as to who the unknown wife was. Passed to Martin in 1872. Well, we know from the marriage certificate that's the son who's married in 1870. There's usually a delay of a year or two before the occupier is changed in the valuation office. Went to Martin's son Timothy in 1926. He'd been in the RIC and was quite Republican and resigned and came home and went back to farming, and went to Timothy's son Michael in 1964 and has now been sold out of the family. Then, as I pointed out on the map, the McMahons and the McGraths took over the piece of land across the other side of the crossroads, and that land went from Michael to John in 1864, which tallies with the John who got married in 1861. A house was built. There was no house on the land when Michael McMahon took it over. John's widow Honor took it over in 1906, their son Michael in 1909, his widow in 1931, and another son in 1941. These records go up to 1970. So we're now beginning to wonder, the McMahons and the McGraths had two farms beside each other and bought a farm across the road and divided it between them. Were they related? I still haven't proved that. But I discovered yesterday when I was telling one of the McMahon descendants about this, he said, oh yeah, I always heard the McGraths sold up, I don't know when, but I was able to tell him the year from the valuation office records. The last McGrath man in that house was killed in an accident with a pony and trap, and his widow and his children went off to America and they sold the land. And that tallied with what I found in the valuation office. So it's nice to have that bit of oral history that's been passed down from the 1893 she moved to America. And the husband probably died about 6 years before, which is when the land transferred from his name to her name. And that is still remembered in the local oral history 120, 130 years later. Anyway, my two friends are in the DNA databases since 2015 and 2016. And eventually, February this year, a lady called Carol in Australia uploaded her ancestry DNA results. She uploaded twice to GetMatch. Fantastic if you do it even once. I'm much more prepared to tolerate the people with unnecessary duplicate kits than the people who haven't done it at all. And Martin got excited because he had 43 centimorgans shared with her. Michael got even more excited because he had 62 centimorgans shared with her. That could be a pretty distant relation. But she knew that her great-grandfather was Timothy Garvey McMahon, who was born in Kilkee and came to Australia in the 1800s. Now, Kilkee is the biggest town in the locality, so it could even encompass Squarin, which is about 5 or 6 miles away. But she also knew, probably because she has a marriage and a death certificate from Australia for Timothy, with his parents' names on them, because the Australians have a much better civil registration system than ours, that the parents were Michael McMahon and Mary Garvey. That's always a lesson. Go sideways in order to go backwards. If you can't find the parents of an ancestor, see was there any brother or sister that emigrated to a jurisdiction with better records, and you might get the names there. So we started thinking, who were Michael McMahon and Mary Garvey? And we went back to the transcriptions which are on the Clare Library website from the graveyard in Kilfeera. And on that one, there is this tombstone erected by Mary Garvey, alias McMahon, in memory of her beloved husband, Michael McMahon, who died 1861, aged 57. May he rest in peace. So that looks like the ancestors of the DNA match in Australia. This one is quite covered with lichen, but you can just about make it out. And up on the top, not sure how much you can see here, there are all the symbols of the Passion. I thought Christy Conniff might be here, who's the big expert on tombstones. He would love this one. And then there's this yoke here sitting on top of it, which we'll come back to later. Then we noticed in that list that I flashed up a minute ago, the two graves are number 492 and number 493. And we have a sketch map which has survived, and they're down here at the bottom. They're right beside each other. So not only have we people in Ireland and people in Australia with a DNA match, but we have their ancestors' graves, and they're in the same graveyard, and they're right beside each other. Then we went to the baptismal records. Again, they're offline because the register is in bad shape. It was never microfilmed, but we found 4 children of Michael McMahon and Mary Garvey, and they included a Martin McMahon of roughly the correct age, born 1842 or 1843. The dates are almost all worn off this register, right in the middle of the range of implied birth years from our later sources. So it looks like this is the family that started out in Kilfeera, which is the address given in the parish register, and moved to Querrin. So not quite from Donegal, but from the same direction. And we know the move happened sometime between 1846 and 1855. So then we went back to the cemetery, 2 more visits to the cemetery, and we found this yoke. This is the thing sitting on the corner of the McMahon Garvey headstone, completely covered in lichen. Got out all the tricks of the trade, the bottle of talcum powder, rubbed it with brass. John Tierney has taught us wonderful lessons in reading tombstones. Got my mirrors out, reflected the sunlight on it. Can you see anything on that one? If I blow it up and you really squint, you might see a few letters. But a lot of squinting and shining lights on it and so on came up with this, in loving memory of Martin McMahon of Querrin, his sons Michael, John, Peter, daughters Bridget and Nora. They exactly match the children of Martin McMahon from the 1901 and 1911 census, and the stone is sitting down on the Michael McMahon and Mary Garvey headstone. It was under our noses. We had stood at John McMahon's grave and never looked at the one beside it, and never looked at that lichen and covered monument, and thought that that might be the evidence we needed. It was the DNA from Australia that directed us that way. So we're now quite happy. There must be some relation, but better still, we have another cousin. We have Johnny, who's another second cousin of Martin and Michael, descended from a third child of John McMahon and Honor Hanrahan. And we knew he was an Ancestry DNA, and we were trying to get in touch with him, and we were trying to get in touch with his friend who signed him up for Ancestry DNA, whose mobile phone was broken for about 3 months and we couldn't contact him. But eventually this week, Johnny's results were shared with me, and I looked at his match with Carol, and it said extremely high, 165 centimorgans shared. That is pretty good for third cousins. We have a probability table by Leah LaPearl Larkin, which says 160 centimorgans shared has 28% chance of being a second cousin, 54% chance of being a second cousin once removed, 15% chance of being a third cousin, only 3% chance of being more distant than a third cousin. So now, purely on the DNA, we're 97% certain that Johnny and Carol in Australia are third cousins, and hence that Michael and Martin, who share less DNA with Carol, are also her third cousins, and that Michael McMahon and Mary Garvey are the ancestors of all these people. And that 3% is purely on the DNA. You can reduce that even further because we have all the other circumstantial evidence from the oral tradition and from the written records that I've worked through. So I would love to have the 8 descendants I know of Michael McMahon and Mary Garvey all in GetMatch, and to do an autosomal matrix for all 8. Unfortunately, so far we only have 3, so all we have are Michael and Martin and Carol, with their 236 shared by Michael and Martin, which is typical of second cousins, and the 43 and 62, which are on the low side for third cousins. We'll add Johnny there, and he'll be 100 plus on the high side for third cousins. So that's how you put it all together. A lot of hard work, a lot of slog, but eventually you get a satisfying result. So please encourage all your relatives to send in their DNA, upload your family trees, upload everything to GetMatch. Your descendants will be eternally grateful to you for leaving them your DNA. If you anonymize your results, your descendants will curse you in perpetuity for hiding from them, just like we curse our ancestors who didn't even have the opportunity to put their DNA online. So thank you very much for listening.